Apparently, it is not only adults who struggle with the presence of God, what it means to pray, and what results we might offer. I have here what a friend sent me a few years ago, a collection from children's prayers. You've probably heard it, but you need to hear it again because I'm going to read them. Dear God, thank you for the baby brother, but what I asked for was a puppy. I never asked for anything before. You can look it up. Joyce. Dear God, I wish you would not make it so easy for people to come apart. I had to have 3 stitches and a shot. Janice. Dear God, I bet it is very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family, and I can never do that. Friend of mine. Dear God, my grandpa says that you were around when he was a little boy. Just how far back do you go? Love, Dennis. And here a perplexing one. Dear God, it's okay that you made different religions, but don't you get mixed up sometimes? We do. Dear God, how come you did all those miracles in the old days and don't do any now? Dear God, please send Dennis Clark to a different camp this year. Peter. Dear God, is Reverend Coe a friend of yours, or do you just know him through business? And then sometimes a very logical question. Dear God, in Sunday school they told us what you do. Who does it when you're on vacation? And then you well remember the 6-year-old drawing a picture, and her brother came over and said, "What are you drawing?" "I'm drawing a picture of God." Nobody knows what God looks like. They will when I'm done. I wish we had the confidence some children have. The honesty, of course, is so helpful. The Greek people were trying to find out what possibilities they had with any kind of God they could think of. They had developed over a number of years, in fact decades and even centuries, a variety of different monuments. And just to make sure, they had a monument, you read it, to an unknown God. What were they trying to do? They particularly did not believe that whatever gods they had cared much about human beings. Were they trying to reach out somehow to find, to discover, in the seeking, to somehow discover something that would connect them beyond the measure of the human experience? I don't know, but we've done that also, haven't we? We too have struggled with the presence of God, and in our prayers we have been told that if we pray long enough or with faith, that they will come to pass. But do they? Is this a known God or an unknown God that you and I spend time trying to reach out toward or find or seeking somehow? Philip Yancey spoke of growing up and looking for that God. He writes in a book called Disappointment with God, how many expectations he had about who God was and is and what God could do, somehow along the way deeply disappointed him and his faith. Some of us have been there too, have we not? Someone else, Richard Elliott Friedman, writes about the disappearance of God. Not only is God sometimes disappointing, but God has completely disappeared. Have some of us come to the place of prayer or the place of agony or the place of a crisis and there uttered ourselves, Have you disappeared? The disappearance of God. And then Helmut Thielicke, during World War II, in Germany, had to preach to parishioners as they struggled with where God was in the evil and difficulty of those days. He wound up speaking about it as the silence of God. Have you experienced the silence of God? Is the silence of God unintentional, accidental? Is it good or evil? Has God quit caring, or did God ever care? You've heard the psalmists cry out and wonder where God was in that agony. You've heard others in Old or New Testament speak to that. You've heard Paul ask for some relief to the thorn he had, which was obviously of discomfort, and no answer. What do we do with the silence of God? Do we understand what it means? Is silence always bad? Other people have struggled too, have they not? My grandmother and grandfather, missionaries to Brazil, had some wonderful children, but they had two as adults. One drowned in front of them at a church picnic. The other one disappeared in med school, never to be seen or heard of again. The suffering and agony of the disconnect. How many times did they pray? How many times did she look in the crowd for a face and never found it? As a youth, as an associate pastor in Northern Virginia, I had the honor and the difficulty of burying 4 soldiers in Arlington Cemetery from the Vietnam War. Those were all difficult. They were all under 25 of age. But there was one I'll not soon forget. He had a wife with 2 small children. His father was a deacon in the church. And the father called me and said, "She's locked the door. She will let no one in. Is there any way you can reach to her? We don't know what to do." I went. I knocked. I knocked twice, and I decided maybe privacy was what she needed, and I started to walk out when the door swung open. But I didn't see her. Slowly, I walked into the front area of the room, and there across the room, she was beating the wall with her fists. I tried then to pull her back so she would not harm herself. She turned the fists and began to beat on my chest as she said repeatedly, for the next 30 minutes, "What did your God do to my husband?" We have so many questions when there are no quick answers. In the Bible, somewhere along the way, we've heard people that supposedly heard something, but the agony of it all, the challenge of the silence is still with us. And does it inform our faith, or does it reduce our faith? We're here in the midst of that struggle. Are we not? When 19 children in Uvalde, Texas, and 2 teachers are gunned down while their parents outside with officers are praying, what is happening to the prayer? Where in the agony of life do we have any kind of answer for that kind of disappointing silence? I was a member of John Claypool's church when a lovely little 12-year-old daughter of his, I taught her swimming, began to show signals of leukemia. In those days, there were so many limitations to medications and relief. And he spoke often when the medications again began to make no difference, that he had to put a washcloth between her teeth as she bit something in her suffering and agony. And then she died. This is a very imperfect world, isn't it? It's a very unfair world in so many ways. Yes, there's beauty to it. Yes, there's hope. But as you and I gather, sometimes we bring the agony of the silence, do we not? Can there be any good in the midst of our waiting? Can there be any possibility that faith can be increased? That may be why we're here. And so I offer 3 words in the midst of the silence. The first one is that silence can be the beginning of a deeper faith. When we hear nothing, with Frederick Buechner, sometimes we walk into the hungering dark, and there we look in ways we had not looked before. Is it the furniture of heaven or the furniture on earth that will sustain us somewhere along the way in the midst of the silence? Faith can be born in a stronger way. Ask John McCain, crashed 5 times, that Arizona Navy pilot, 5 times, and the last time he was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. What happens in the loneliness and the isolation and the question of whether or not is anyone listening? But somehow, rather than lose what he had found, he began to find it in a different way. Silence, sometimes, while we're waiting, can become a friend. But you say, not suffering. There's no good that comes from suffering or agony. So what do we do with that? Can there be a possibility that sometimes in the pain and suffering, we can discover something new about God and about ourselves? Yes, this is an imperfect world. Yes, there's chaos, and the world is not subject to God. Romans 28 and 20 indicates that. But in the midst of it all, what do we know about suffering? William Sloane Coffin lost a very dear family member in a tragic accident. An elder of his church called and said, "Where was God in your pain?" And after a long pause, he replied, "I believe God was the first one crying." In the midst of what we do not know, do we know of a God who cares? The Greeks did not. These gods were distant, monuments and cold. Do we get a different kind of noise or sound from the Hebrew picture of God, from an understanding even in the silence and in the suffering of life that there can be good? I'm amazed at the difficulty we have in immigration at our border and the pain of people. And in the midst of that struggle and how to be responsible and compassionate and helpful, I listened to the story as I heard from our extension with CBF people on the border as they spoke about these folks, one after another being interviewed, coming all the way from Venezuela, 4 months in the jungle, in the water, in the midst of the pain. They were finding a sense of purpose they would not disallow. In the midst of the suffering, somehow they were finding themselves more committed than ever. In the midst of the suffering. Can anything else come in the silence? I do believe while you're waiting and while I'm waiting, that somewhere along the way there can be an inner sense of self that is born or reborn as we find resources within ourselves in the midst of the agony, the silence, or the pain that we had not found before. Somewhere in the process, sometimes when we walk through the darkness, there is a new discovery of the image of God within us, the capacity to love and care, the capacity to struggle, the capacity to engage and survive. Can that be another source of what God intended at places where God will not, cannot change what is going on at the time? A few years ago, some of you know, 1897, when I was in college, I taught swimming every summer. 7, 8, 9-year-olds and intermediates. The concluding 2 weeks of this Red Cross program, which I had, was to stand on the opposite side of the pool while a child got in the water to make his 15-yard swim. I watched and focused on their eyes. Part of what I did each time was to see if I could keep them at least focused on me when they'd come up for air. Somewhere halfway or a little past halfway, they would come up, and either there was a look of sheer panic, or as they looked at me, there was a sheer determination, and they bobbed the head back down and finished the course. And the satisfaction at the end, I celebrated. Understood, once every 2 weeks I had to jump in and pull one out because he was drinking a little too much water. But somewhere in that young experience of children, they had found the resources from within for courage, for strength, for determination. And that, I believe, is perhaps what we discover in the waiting, in the silence. You may not know the name, excuse me, Alex Levy. Alex Levy was a boy in Lithuania and Russia when he had to flee, and he watched every one of his family but his aunt be killed during World War II and the Holocaust. He managed to get to the United States, wound up as a teenager in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, discovered in the process that he was a true orphan in so many ways and claimed by no one. He began to work for himself and then decided that he would help others and became a psychologist. A few years ago, he decided to create an institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For what? To deal with the orphaned adults who crossed his path in the world. He himself, an orphaned adult, struggling with belonging to no one and wondering if anyone cared. He decided to make a particular place safe for those who had no family to find family. You'd enjoy the book, The Orphaned Adult. He speaks in a unique way about it. Passed away just 2 years ago. Do we believe that the Church of Jesus Christ, that the family of God was also designed for the orphaned adult, for the person who's found no love, for the person who is waiting and angry at God because anger is a form of care, who understands that the world is unfair but wants God to be fair right now? Is there a time and a place where faith can increase, where suffering can be used for a gift, and where inner resources are discovered? The town is Devonport, England, small town outside of Manchester, 12,000 people. Little neighborhood with people who knew each other. The neighborhood gathered one day, however, because there was a fire in the neighbor's yard that became a fire in the house. Neighbors gathered around. They had called the fire department, and they were all looking and watching this house come apart in the flames. On the second floor, there was a little boy, 9 or 10 years old. Through the window, they could hear him screaming, and they wondered what they might do. But no one moved until from the back, a neighbor, John William Brackenridge, moved up to the edge of the house and found the drain pipe where the water went up and shimmied up to the second floor deck, where he broke a window. About the time the flames were engulfing the boy, he grabbed him out, put him on his shoulder, and came down, burning his hands with safety. 3 weeks later, this orphan child had no family, but there was an inheritance. Insurance was tremendous. And they gathered in a court of law to figure out who would be adopting this 9-year-old boy. The court was full. There was money involved. And then the court judge decided, in the midst of the requirements and the yelling and the shouting, that he would let the boy decide who might adopt him. And so he got down from his chair and he weaved through the crowd. It seemed as if he were looking for a face. And he came at the back of the room to a man who was seated with his arms crossed. And he took his arm and he pulled it out. And he saw the bandages of burnt hands. And he turned to the judge and he said, "This is the one." Somewhere along the way, this God who is unknown may have come our way. Perhaps you know someone else whose hands were damaged, and maybe in the midst of our agony and pain, the suffering, the loneliness and the isolation, maybe he came to show us the face of God. Do you believe that? I do.